Iran's foreign minister just delivered a message that should be dominating every global headline right now, yet somehow it's still not getting the level of attention it deserves. He said the Strait of Hormuz is open, but in the same breath, he made it clear that it is closed to Iran's enemies, and he didn't frame that as a temporary wartime move or a threat. He framed it as policy. That distinction matters more than most people realize, because what Iran is doing is not a traditional blockade. It's not a full shutdown of the world's most critical oil corridor. It's something far more calculated, far more controlled, and arguably far more powerful. Iran is not closing the Strait of Hormuz. It is taking control of it. It is deciding who gets to pass, who has to negotiate, who pays, and who gets denied. It is rewriting the operating rules of a waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil flows every single day. And right now, there is no unified global response to what that actually means. Over the next few minutes, let's break this down properly. What Iran has declared, how this system is already being implemented on the water, why multiple governments are now quietly engaging with Tehran, and why this situation could permanently reshape how global energy flows are controlled. Because this is not just another escalation headline. This is a structural shift. Here is what actually happened. On March 21st, Iran's foreign minister publicly laid out the country's position in one of the clearest statements we've seen so far. His wording was precise. The strait is open, but it is closed to ships belonging to Iran's enemies, specifically those tied to countries that attack or threaten Iran. For everyone else, passage is possible. But then came the most important part. He said that Iran is ready to provide safe passage, and that any country or operator seeking to move through the strait simply needs to contact Tehran to coordinate how that transit will happen. That one sentence changes everything, because now we are no longer talking about access to an international waterway as a default right. We are talking about access that must be requested, negotiated, and approved, country by country, ship by ship. That is not the language of a blockade. That is the language of a gatekeeper, and the gate is already operational. According to multiple maritime tracking and intelligence reports, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, has established a controlled transit corridor near Larak Island inside the strait. Ships are being directed through a specific path that runs close to Iranian territorial waters. As they approach, they are visually identified and, in some cases, required to communicate via radio with Iranian naval or port authorities. This is not theoretical. This is already happening. Several vessels have successfully passed through this corridor, and in at least one confirmed case, a tanker operator reportedly paid around $2 million to secure guaranteed passage. That number alone tells you how serious the situation has become, because once money enters the equation in a structured way, it stops being an emergency measure and starts looking like a system. And that system may be here to stay. Iran's parliament is already discussing the possibility of formalizing transit fees, not as a temporary wartime workaround, but as a permanent feature. At the same time, senior political figures inside Iran have been unusually direct about their long-term intentions. The country's parliament speaker stated that the strait will not return to its previous status after the conflict. That alone signals a major shift. Even more striking, members of Iran's strategic advisory bodies have openly described a future where the strait becomes a tool of ongoing leverage, not just during conflict, but afterward. A mechanism to pressure rivals, influence trade flows, and shape global energy access on Iran's terms. These are not off-the-cuff remarks. These are coordinated signals, and when you step back and look at how events have unfolded over the past few weeks, the pattern becomes clear. This didn't happen all at once. It happened in stages. First came the shock phase. Iran signaled a full closure, warning that any vessel attempting to cross could be targeted. That alone was enough to send oil markets into panic. Prices surged sharply. Tanker traffic dropped almost overnight. Dozens upon dozens of ships began anchoring outside the strait, waiting for clarity that never came. For a brief moment, it looked like a complete shutdown, but then came the adjustment phase. Iran began quietly clarifying that the closure was not absolute. It applied specifically to certain countries and affiliations. Ships linked to the United States, Israel, and close Western allies faced restrictions. Others did not, and suddenly, movement resumed. Chinese vessels began passing. Indian tankers entered negotiations. Regional operators started testing the system. What initially looked like chaos began to reveal structure. This was not a shutdown. It was selective control, a system with pressure points and release valves. And those valves were opened for the countries willing to engage directly with Tehran. Now we are in the third phase, institutionalization. Multiple governments are now in active discussions with Iran to coordinate maritime access. This includes countries that rely heavily on energy imports and cannot afford prolonged disruption. Ships seeking passage are being required to submit detailed information in advance. Ownership structures, cargo type, destination, routing plans. That information is being processed through networks aligned with Iranian authorities. Once cleared, vessels are guided through specific routes under observation. Some ships have reportedly disabled tracking systems on approach, only to reactivate them once inside the controlled corridor. All of this points to one conclusion. Iran has effectively built a checkpoint system for the most important oil transit route on Earth. And access to that checkpoint is not evenly distributed. Now consider what this means economically. The Strait of Hormuz normally handles around 20 million barrels of oil per day. There are alternative pipelines in the region, but their capacity is limited. They cannot fully replace the volume that flows through the strait. That means any disruption or even partial restriction has immediate global consequences. The countries most affected are not just Western economies. Asia is heavily exposed. China, India, Japan, and South Korea collectively account for a massive share of the oil that passes through Hormuz. For some of these countries, a large portion of their total crude imports depends on this single passage. These are not flexible supply chains. These are structural dependencies. Yes, some of these nations maintain strategic reserves. That buys time. But reserves are not a long-term solution. They are a buffer, and buffers run out. Meanwhile, other countries that rely almost entirely on imported energy are already feeling the strain. Emergency measures, rerouting strategies, and contingency planning are being activated. Global energy markets are reacting accordingly. Volatility has increased, prices remain elevated, and uncertainty is now a constant factor. And then there is the geopolitical layer, because not everyone is losing in this scenario. Higher oil prices benefit certain exporters. Reduced competition shifts demand patterns. In particular, countries already operating under sanctions or pricing pressure suddenly find themselves in a stronger position. When supply tightens globally, discounts disappear, and that reshapes the entire market dynamic. Now add the military and political dimension. The United States has issued strong warnings, indicating that continued restrictions on the strait could trigger a response. Deadlines have been mentioned, options have been signaled. But Iran's response has been just as firm. Any direct attack on its infrastructure, especially energy or power facilities, would trigger a full closure of the strait. Not selective, not conditional, total. And not temporary. Iran has indicated that such a closure would remain in place until any damage is repaired. At the same time, warnings have been issued about potential escalation across the wider region. Critical infrastructure, energy networks, and shipping lanes could all become targets in a broader confrontation. And here is where the situation becomes even more complex, because international alignment is not as solid as it might appear. Several key countries have shown reluctance to participate in any coordinated military effort to forcibly reopen the strait under current conditions. That hesitation creates space, and Iran is using that space effectively. Because while missiles and military headlines dominate the news cycle, the real leverage point in this entire situation is the strait itself. This is where economic pressure translates directly into global impact. Now consider the legal side. Under international maritime law, there is a principle known as transit passage. It allows ships to move through international straits without obstruction. In theory, that should apply here. But reality is more complicated. Iran does not fully accept the same interpretation of these rules. It argues for a different framework that gives coastal states more authority over transit conditions. At the same time, enforcement of international law depends on political will and institutional mechanisms. And in this case, both are limited. There is no easy way to enforce a legal standard without escalating into direct confrontation. And that gap between what is legally defined and what is practically enforceable is exactly where Iran has positioned itself. Right in the middle of that gap. What we are seeing now is not just a temporary disruption. It is the early stages of a parallel system, a system where access to a global trade route is no longer automatic, but negotiated. Where approval replaces assumption, where control is exercised not through complete denial but through selective permission. Countries that want access engage directly, ships that comply move, ships that do not wait, and over time that behavior becomes normalized. That is how systems change. Not overnight, but through repeated actions that gradually become accepted reality. Every ship that passes through this controlled corridor reinforces the system. Every negotiation acknowledges it. Every payment, formal or informal, strengthens it. This is not about legal recognition. It is about practical control. And practical control over time shapes the real world far more than written agreements. That is the deeper story here. Iran is not just reacting to a conflict, it is using the moment to reposition itself within the global energy structure, not through outright domination, but through strategic leverage. And it is doing so in a way that is difficult to counter without significant risk, because any attempt to forcibly reverse this system carries the potential for wider escalation. So the world hesitates, and in that hesitation, the system grows stronger. Now we reach the key question: what happens next? There are several possible paths: de-escalation through negotiation, a partial normalization of traffic, a formalization of transit rules, or a continued standoff that hardens this system into something permanent. At this moment, none of those outcomes are guaranteed. But one thing is already clear: the Strait of Hormuz is no longer functioning the way it used to. In theory, it remains an international waterway. In practice, it is becoming a managed corridor, and the manager is Tehran. The rules governing that corridor are no longer just the ones written decades ago in international agreements. They are being rewritten in real time, ship by ship, decision by decision. And that shift has consequences that extend far beyond the region, because every economy that depends on energy flowing through that narrow passage is now indirectly affected by how this system evolves. The strait is still open. That part is technically true. But what open means has fundamentally changed, and that change may turn out to be one of the most important geopolitical developments of this entire period.